Our ordeal is finally over.
Or not.
Scrap.
Hey guys, Grandy Tamias here, and 10 years ago today, Transformers Prime concluded with the movie length, if you can call 65 minutes a movie these days, Predacons Rising. So today, I thought I'd look back on this series that means so much to me, and discuss its highlights, some missed potential, and the legacy it left behind. Now, I'm definitely not the first person to do a retrospective on this series, and I know it has a mixed reputation, with it getting increasingly negative in the last few years. And some of the critique is fair. I mean, I myself even made a video about how it squandered the potential of Dreadwing. Check out that video if you haven't. But as someone who saw Transformers Prime during its original run, had the toys, and was an autistic preteen when it came out, don't be surprised if I come off a little biased. I'll still try to be as fair as possible because I won't deny that there are issues, even if they don't bother me as much. Your mileage may vary is what I'm saying. Also, if that description of myself I just gave applies to you as well, we're cool. As I'm sure most fans know, Transformers Prime was brought about by Hasbro as part of their aligned continuity of Transformers media, which notably included the War and Fall of Cybertron video games. Despite Hasbro's insisted connections between these properties, I've personally always considered Transformers Prime separate from the games. I mean, it's not like the connectivity to Prime was a big selling point for Fall of Cybertron, or vice versa when Prime came out after War for Cybertron. Transformers Prime really can, and practically does, stand on its own from the other facets of the really not all that aligned continuity, regardless of their medium. While not my first exposure to it, this was the newest series to come out after I had discovered the Transformers franchise. Although my family had cable, it took me a few months until I found out that Hasbro had their own TV channel, and because of that, I started watching the first few episodes of the show out of order, which had an impact on my overall impression of it. The first episode I saw was episode 7, Scrap Heap, which has no Decepticons and put a lot of focus on the human characters, particularly Raphael, as he, Jack, and Miko helped the Autobots get rid of an infestation of Scraplets. It gave me the impression that this was a little kids show with no stakes and heartfelt messages, kind of like Rescue Bots. The characters, I'll get more into most of them later in the video, but I was scratching my head like, who's this Bulkhead guy? Why is RC blue? And why is Bumblebee beeping and not talking through the radio despite being based on his Bayformers design? Yes, I was that kid. It didn't help with the next episode I saw, which was actually the previous episode, Masters and Students. Why does Starscream look like that? Why does Soundwave look like that? What happened to Megatron? What the hell is Dark Energon? At least it started to shift my perspective of the show's tone with the fight between Skyquake and the Autobots, leading to the former's rather gruesome death. I continued watching episodes 8, 9, and 10 as they came out, and they all combined aspects of the previous 2 episodes I had seen, introducing new characters and things, and having little to no relation to those other 2 episodes I saw, or each other. Of course, this was early in the series, so I understand now that they had a lot to set up. Then again, I guess this could also be considered a negative since they delayed the progression of the show's main plot. Then again, that would have resulted in Megatron returning even sooner than he did, which makes things less dramatic. During the air date gap between the 10th and 11th episodes, I saw the 5-part Darkness Rising miniseries after buying it on iTunes and watching it on a teeny little iPod. Damn, I feel old. But I enjoyed it nonetheless, and I was surprised that they killed Cliffjumper, especially since I had just known that this version existed, since he wasn't mentioned in episodes 6 through 10. It's such a shame that Cliff's gotten the short end of the stick for so long. Not a lot of versions of him after G1 got much time to shine, and before being killed no less. Prime Cliffjumper was so cool with the horns on his car mode and the design that wasn't just a red Bumblebee. Although, fun fact, after the character designers learned that The Rock would be voicing him, they had to rush to give him a redesign. They didn't have time to tweak both modes, so they only buffed out his robot mode with rounded arms and legs, while keeping his square-looking Dodge Challenger mode. That's probably why his toys sucked. This fact comes from the book Transformers: The Art of Prime, which I'll be mentioning a few more times throughout this video because it's really cool and informative. Seriously, I highly recommend finding a copy for yourself. But getting back to Darkness Rising, the animation was a little rougher, like, for example, some of the characters were weirdly shiny, and Megatron's fusion cannon is missing in this shot, something that actually made it onto official promotional renders. I could be here all day if I wanted to talk about animation errors, but as for the story, I was surprised that they had set up the significance of Unicron as early as they did. I usually thought of him as a late-game threat, and yeah, he plays a big part in the climax of the first season and the Predacons Rising movie, but I don't know, I would have expected Unicron to not be mentioned until much later. I thought the way they introduced the main plotline was good, like with the Decepticons not having had any significant activity in 3 years, and that they treat Megatron's return as a huge deal. And it makes me wonder what happened before those 3 years. Like, yeah, they show RC and Cliffjumper arriving on Earth in a later episode, but it's not clear how long ago that takes place. Was it during those 3 years? Was it decades? Were there any other Autobots with Optimus that died or left before the start of the series? How long have they been in cahoots with the military? That'd be a really good premise for a prequel/revival of the series. I won't go through the rest of the show's plotlines in chronological order, but I'll mention the bigger ones and aspects about the show's universe that really stood out to me. I love how the show emphasizes Cybertronian biology, even down to their genetic material. Honestly, I could do a whole video about this, so if you guys are interested, let me know if you have any theories or observations that you'd like me to bring up. I can cover things like how the Predacons were cloned, where protoforms come from, the different organs and their functions, and how this all fits in with the more magical aspects like sparks and the powers of Primus and Unicron. But for now, I will say that it shows how well thought out this universe is, and that the show's creators really wanted to treat these aliens as living beings instead of machines that can be programmed or made from generic parts. One aspect that I've seen a lot of complaints about is the show's tendency to have characters go on scavenger hunts. It happens across the entire series, but most especially in the second season, which revolves around the deciphering and acquiring of the Iacon relics. Honestly, I don't really mind this trope all that much. I think it's a nice way to keep the characters on the move, and it adds to the world building, and the hunt for each relic has its own stakes and tension. I've also seen the same complaint applied to the Bay movies and Rise of the Beasts too, which made them formulaic. Which I guess is true, but at this point I've accepted that scavenger hunts are kind of important to the identity of this franchise. Like even as far back as G1, there was the Heart of Cybertron, the Key to Vector Sigma, the Pearl of Bahudin, and the Cosmic Rust bug thing. Besides, the relics themselves are pretty cool, like the Phase Shifter, the Star Saber, and the Forge of Solus Prime. The only point where I think scavenger hunts become a problem was in the middle of the third season, mostly because it felt rushed and the Predacon bones didn't serve any immediate function or threat. We had to wait several episodes until we saw the result of getting them, as opposed to every other relic in the series where their power is demonstrated or serves the plot of the episode it's introduced in. Heck, even the Forge served a purpose in its first episode, even though it was used as just a regular hammer. Not to mention, the Autobots were all the more motivated to get it to build a new T-Cog for Bumblebee. The action in this show was done amazingly. Just about every character has their own unique fighting style, whether it be RC's ninja-like jumps and twists, Megatron's prowess as a gladiator, or Dreadwing's samurai sword skills. Some of my favorite fights in the whole series include Optimus Prime vs. Megatron on the space bridge and the volcano, Wheeljack vs. Hardshell, Megatron vs. the Insecticon, Bulkhead vs. Dreadwing, Ultra Magnus and Wheeljack vs. Predaking, Megatron vs. Predaking, Optimus and Dreadwing vs. Starscream, Soundwave vs. Wheeljack, RC vs. Arachnid and the Insecticon Hive, Optimus Prime vs. Nemesis Prime. Ah, God, it's so good. The suspense was also really good too, especially with how they showed characters like Cliffjumper and Breakdown brutally dying. So I was genuinely concerned for Bulkhead when Hardshell shot him in Toxicity. That was the closest he had come to death, which is really something when you consider that, unlike animated Bulkhead, Prime Bulkhead is a much more seasoned warrior, being that he is a member of the Wreckers. Moments like that, and characters like Tailgate and Silas dying, gave the show an overall dark tone. And I've heard a lot of comparisons in this regard to shows like Star Wars The Clone Wars and the 2012 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series. More so the latter, since it was around the same time as TF Prime, and both shows shared some voice actors. Speaking of which, this show introduced me to several big actors and voice actors, and taught me a lot about that profession as a whole. Of course, Peter Cullen and Frank Welker reprised their roles as Optimus Prime and Megatron respectively, the first time they had done so in the same show or movie since G1, but the manner of their performances is somewhat different to how they were in the 80s. For instance, Optimus Prime's voice is very similar to how he was in the Michael Bay films, but he's a little more soft-spoken, definitely as a result of the character not being as aggressive as in those other films. It's hard to articulate exactly what I mean, but his movie voice has a more gravelly tone that's missing in the Prime series.
We are autonomous robotic organisms from the planet Cybertron.
We are autonomous robotic organisms from the planet Cybertron.
And once you notice the difference in cadence between these two versions of Optimus, it really makes you hear his voice differently throughout the entire series. Frank Welker as Megatron is definitely more menacing than in G1, where he was a typical cartoon villain who gets his plans foiled in nearly every episode, so it was hard to take him seriously. Whereas Prime Megatron's voice really gives him a presence that makes you fear being in the same room as him. And rightfully so, he was a gladiator after all, so he can give you a whole new definition of brutality. And yeah, some of that presence does wear down as the show goes on, but in my opinion, it doesn't have any significant impact on the epicness of his fight scenes. In fact, he's more reserved and only takes action on the ground when absolutely necessary, which further mitigates the dilution of his threat level. As for the other voices, this was my first exposure to actors like Ernie Hudson, Jeffrey Combs, Adam Baldwin, Peter Mensah, and Gina Torres. It also made me more familiar with actors who were in other things that I had seen, but I never really noticed. Like Michael Ironside, who was in Top Gun, and a lot of other military-related roles apparently, and Tony Todd, who voices Dreadwing, and who was previously involved with Transformers as the Fallen in the Bayverse. But those actors are more well-known from movies. There are some people who are professional cartoon voice actors as well, like Darren Norris as Knockout, who is also a bunch of characters in The Fairly Odd Parents, including Timmy's dad. Like, sometimes I can almost hear Knockout cursing Dinkelberg. Nolan North, who voices Smokescreen, also voices the Krang in the aforementioned TMNT show, as well as Cliffjumper in Fall of Cybertron.
Can't believe you outranked me.
Where he just uses the same voice as Smokescreen, which isn't helped by the fact that his debut in the show was only a few weeks after the launch of the game. Not to sound too negative though, I still think Nolan North is a pretty talented voice actor, but I really gotta give it to Kevin Michael Richardson, who not only does the most characters on the show, including Bulkhead, Makeshift, the Nemesis, and a ton of the Viacons, but is in just about every other modern cartoon and animated film, too. He was Kamek in the Super Mario Bros. Movie, but he's also known for a lot of deep voice characters. Some of the roles I know him best for are as Captain Ganchu from the Lilo and Stitch franchise, the Shredder, again from TMNT 2012, and Maurice in multiple Madagascar TV series. There are others I could talk about at length, as well as many of the other guest voice actors on the show, but this is going to be a long video as it is, so it's best that I move on. The animation in this series holds up incredibly well. In fact, it looks just as good, if not better, than a lot of shows today. Yeah, like I said, it has its fair share of errors, and some really hilarious ones at that, but the lighting, texture work, and rendering give this series a look that's really immersive. Not to mention minute details they work in, like scratches and paint chips on the robots, the way characters like Starscream and Megatron use their eyebrows, or tiny steps they take while they're standing idle. This series has a lot of really good life lessons and character development, like RC overcoming trauma, loss, and revenge, Ultra Magnus viewing the team as family rather than soldiers, and Smokescreen learning responsibility. But I think one of my favorites is Ratchet learning to appreciate humans through his bond with Raph, and why they're worth protecting even at the well-being of his own planet. Seriously, that moment where he goes on a tirade to the rest of the Autobots about destroying the Omega Lock to save Earth is perhaps the greatest moment of protagonist-team internal conflict in the entire series. Heck, in my opinion at least, they even made his "we needed that" gag work without taking away from the power of the scene. Speaking of which, I love that gag, and I think it was used the perfect amount, never too often, and most of the time it fit well in the scenes it was used. And the way Jeffrey Combs portrays Ratchet, he is just the definitive version of the character for me. A lot of other characters have some pretty memorable line deliveries by their actors. Like, there's a reason I included Dreadwing's line about betraying his own kind in my video about him. Predacons' threat to Starscream when he first reveals his robot mode was pretty cool too, as were a lot of Knockout's lines.
This is going to be juicy.
One line delivery that I will not excuse, however, is when Optimus Prime literally advertises the toy line.
Autobots, we must become beast hunters.
This is peak cheese, and I do not know how much money they were paying Peter Cullen to say that. Apparently Hasbro didn't think subnaming the show Beast Hunters was enough to let people know there were new toys. Another thing I appreciate is the show's wide use of vocabulary. It introduced me to words like
Bravado,
Cash idiosyncrasies, desecration, dissension, iota,
zenith,
uncouth,
Confidence.
oblique,
contingency.
Is that even a word?
really educational. I'm glad the show's writers didn't oversimplify conversations for the younger fans, and instead put these words on our radars for us to learn about on our own. The lore changes were also really interesting. Some I found odd at first, and others this series introduced me to for the first time. Like, when I first heard that the Predacons were going to be the focus of the third season, I was like, wait, why are they dragons? They were a combiner team in G1. Plus, Predaking was an individual character, yet had similar colors to G1 Predaking. But now I kind of prefer the Prime Predacons over the G1 versions since they weren't too relevant in the 80s. In fact, I kind of prefer them to the Beast Wars Predacons as well, even though I've warmed up to them recently with Rise of the Beasts. Like, I think it makes more sense that the leader of the Prime Predacons is a dragon that has an emblem of a dragon face, whereas the leader of the Beast Wars Predacons is a T-Rex that has an emblem of a wasp face, which resembles one of the lower-ranking members of the faction. Also, I like how in the Art of Prime book, artist Jose Lopez says that because he went nuts with the detail on Predaking, he made a lot of people's lives more difficult. I don't mind the changes to the Insecticons or Unicron being the center of the Earth either. The latter change, I still prefer the classic version over it, but it's neat that idea got some love with how Unicron was adapted into The Last Knight. And unlike the G1, or more recently with the Rise of the Beasts Unicron, this version didn't have any independent, free-thinking followers, unless you count him taking over Megatron's body. Aside from that, the most he could do was raise dead Cybertronians as Terrorcons, which I think by association with name could have been the inspiration for Unicron in Rise of the Beasts, having his heralds be called Terrorcons. And honestly, I don't even like zombies in pop culture, but when Transformers does it, I think it's really cool. Maybe it's just because they aren't constrained by the rules of biology that make it impossible for human corpses to just walk right up again. Although I had heard about the 7 Primes from Revenge of the Fallen, Transformers Prime was my first time learning about Primus and the original 13 Primes. Like, I had never heard of Solus Prime prior to this series, and apparently the dead Prime that Megatron and Dreadwing steal an arm from is supposed to be Sentinel Prime, according to The Art of Prime, but TF Wikinet says that it's supposed to be Liege Maximo. This was also my first exposure to the Wreckers, who I soon after saw the movie version of in Dark of the Moon. The show would later name drop several Wrecker characters who were in the IDW comics and add Sea Spray to their roster. Also, something I forgot to mention in my Dreadwing video is that because they never mentioned Sea Spray outside of loose cannons, it's a real shame that Bulkhead never brought that up during his forced fight with Dreadwing. That would have made the impact of that fight more personal and could have cemented Dreadwing as a new rival for Bulkhead, since Breakdown had been out of the picture by that point. Also, Wheeljack's change from being a mechanic to being a wrecker was awkward for me since, as I've said before, G1 Wheeljack is one of my favorite Autobots. Perhaps another character who fits his personality could have taken his place, like Sideswipe. He liked fighting rough and daring challenges in G1, but honestly, I think Wheeljack's just one of those names Hasbro always wants to keep relevant. Hence why he appears in just about every cartoon, and even in the movies now too. They just slapped his name on this guy, and I'm still not over it. That said, I love his Prime design, and I've grown to appreciate his characterization and his dynamics with the rest of the team, especially in that one episode with him and Ratchet. I've neglected to mention Mech up to this point, and yeah, they can be removed, and the show's main plot would stay largely the same, but at least they gave us a cool new version of Nemesis Prime. Honestly, I've never been a huge fan of Nemesis Prime as a concept, but Transformers Prime has my favorite version of it. Not necessarily a lore change, but I wasn't a big fan of Smokescreen's blue and yellow Beast Hunter's paint job. I would have preferred that he changed into his G1 colors. And much like Wheeljack, Smokescreen could have easily been replaced with a G1 Autobot who fits his personality better. Hot Rod in particular. The show put a lot of emphasis on his carefree, reckless, and fun-seeking personality. And the path of his character development, where he starts out aspiring for greatness and gains a sense of humility, is very similar to Hot Rod as well. He almost takes the Matrix too, but from then on, it kind of turned into a joke for the rest of the series. Maybe the writers were considering something bigger for Smokescreen, but Hasbro shot it down. Maybe he was supposed to be Hot Rod too, who knows. But this is perhaps my biggest issue with the whole series. Other plotlines were cut short too, like Arachnid and Dreadwing, as I mentioned, but this one had the most potential. Okay, finishing things off with Predacons Rising, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the ending. At first, I was disappointed with the movie because I was in disbelief when I saw Optimus Prime sacrifice himself. I was expecting him to survive before I had seen the movie, but over time, I realized that it had to happen for the story. It was the ending, and it needed to have some real weight if they were going to fully accomplish the show's goal of bringing back life to Cybertron. Plus, the show is called Transformers Prime, and what would be a more appropriate way to go out than with the character who the show is named after? Sure, the series wouldn't have necessarily needed Optimus to continue a narrative, and there's more backstory to the Prime lineage that they could have explored, but for what it's worth, I believe that the show did the right thing, and he even left a good message before he left.
Leadership can be earned with or without the Matrix. And in my view, you have each acted as a Prime.
Really, Transformers Prime is one of those shows that made me realize just what I want out of good television. Adventure, a universe with a rich history, a continuous narrative, characters who mature and have complex relationships, build-ups to greater conflicts, and, what the heck, a good relic hunt every once in a while. And the way it remixes old Transformers ideas and makes them work in a new context was done very well most of the time. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that I prefer this series over G1. Mostly because of the action, but G1 also had a habit of introducing backstory elements that were only ever relevant in one episode most of the time, whereas Prime frequently readdresses events and builds upon them. For all its flaws, this series has a special place in my heart, and I can easily recommend it to anyone who wants to start out with Transformers. I know there are still going to be people who hate this show, and I can see why it's not for everyone, but compared to its sequel show, yeah, the less said about that, the better. Feel free to let me know in the comments, what did you think were some of the greatest strengths and weaknesses of Transformers Prime as a series? Who were your favorite characters? And what did you think of the changes that it made to the bigger Transformers mythos? Again, I'd love to make more videos about this series, so if you have any ideas, leave those in the comments as well. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.